in terms of this panel, which is about labor and the environment, and specifically the labor movement and the environmental movement, there has been a disconnect between organized labor and other social movements, at least since the passage of the Taft-Hartley Law in 1947, which isolated radicals from the labor movement, and perhaps this was even true before Taft-Hartley. Unlike Europe, even back in the days of Samuel Gompers sought to distance organized labor from organized socialism. From its origins in the early 1960s, the modern environmental movement has had a decidedly middle-class character, and many rank-and-file industrial workers have seen environmental regulations as a threat to their livelihood. Nevertheless, if an industrial plant is polluting the environment in which it is situated, the pollution inside the plant, and I know this from personal experience in the automobile industry, is exponentially higher than the environmental degradation is on the outside. And as a consequence of this, there were industrial workers, especially in particular industries, particularly in the chemical industry, that were concerned with their work environment. And probably the leading figure in this movement was Tony Mazzocchi, who was an official of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And he was extremely instrumental. And a matter of fact, President Nixon even mentioned his name with the passage of the OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety Act. And so that was a clear link between the question of environmentalism and the labor movement. Then in 1999, there was the World Trade Organization Summit in Seattle, and massive protests against it, which became known as the Battle of Seattle, in which labor unions were protesting the undermining of labor laws and labor regulations as a consequence of these trade agreements, and environmentalists were protesting against the undermining of environmental regulations as a consequence of these agreements. And they came together under the slogan, Teamsters and Turtles together at last. One of the most important, I would like to begin this discussion by introducing Andrea Nichols, who is works on environmental issues for the LA County Fed, and will speak specifically about workplace environmental issues and whatever else she wants to talk about.
Thank you, Gabe. So for the record, I actually don't, I'm not here representing the views of the LA County Fed or any of its affiliates. I'm here as Andrea Nichols, and I actually don't work for the LA County Fed anymore. Just a little fun fact. I'm actually transitioning into another job this coming week. So, but you know, hopefully, what I'm going to talk about today, that's going to reflect some of my experiences working with different unions in different capacities. For the past couple of years, I've been working as the health and safety director of the Fed. And so basically, I've been working with different unions and organizations.
A little bit of a story. In April of 1997, a company called Tosco did Unical was sold to Tosco in what was called an asset sale. So they sold all of their California facilities to Tosco. We had no successorship language in our contracts. Tosco made everyone reapply for their jobs, and we had many, many workers who were not hired and lost their jobs. The next goal in our negotiations was to get what's called successorship language. But in the fight with Tosco, you naturally, whenever you're in a fight with somebody or something, right, you look at, okay, who are their enemies? Their enemy is our friend, our ally. So we discovered that Tosco had a SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation against a environmental justice organization named Committees for a Better Environment. Meantime, my then international union had been looking at engaging with the environmental movement, and my then international union, of all the different environmental organizations that were around, identified environmental justice organizations as the organizations that we preferred to work with. The reason for that is kind of comes out of the history of these different environmental types of environmental organizations. The Sierra Club, for example, a co-founder of Blue Green Alliance, basically an environmental advocacy organization. They have policy directives and so on and so forth, but the roots of that environmental advocacy is more what I would call in the petty bourgeois. It's not working class. Now, it at least wasn't. For example, when the national park system was founded by Teddy Roosevelt, working class people had no way to get to Sequoia Park. You were lucky if you could get 5 miles out of town. So that's the type of thing. So these national parks were really for rich people. But the environmental justice organizations are different in that they're based in largely in the communities where these heavy industrial sites are located, and they're there because they can't afford to live anywhere else. Or the industrial facilities are intentionally sited in communities of color in poverty because those people have no political power to fight back. So we identified more with the environmental justice wing of the movement at that time, at least I still do today. Let me back up a bit. In February 23, 1999, we had a horrible accident at the Avon refinery, which was owned by Tosco. 4 of our members were killed. 1 was severely burned. And the Chemical Safety Board in their final report identified one of the causes as corrosion of the pipe. The workers were trying to replace a corroded piece of the side cut on the fractionating tower, and a naphtha side cut. It started to leak, and the 5 workers were on the column at the time that the fire broke out, and that's what happened. In the subsequent 2000 negotiations, we, fighting for safety, we did a joint campaign against Tosco for our demands were we wanted instant arbitration of health and safety disputes. And we wanted instant arbitration before what we call the community ombudsman, who was selected by the community, not by the company and not by the union. And we would each argue our case before the community, and the community would decide. That effort was unsuccessful in that regard.
Coalition made up probably of about 25 different organizations, but all of the key players with the city. So there were like 8 unions that represented city workers. There were a variety of environmental organizations that were concerned about, the environment, not only in terms of what these buildings presented, but the environment in general, all around the city. And there were a number of community organizations, mostly scope organizations like Agenda, that organized door-to-door almost in South Central. So this was a wonderful model. If you take a look at the project itself, it was less than a drop in terms of what we need to do for the environment, but it was a wonderful model of how to build an alliance with labor, environment, and community organizations. And it was front-loaded. By that I mean jobs were present from the very beginning, and not only jobs, but the right kind of jobs. And not only the right kind of jobs, but job training, because it was a community that very often didn't immediately possess the skills to go into apprenticeship programs. So there were pre-apprenticeship programs. And all of this was researched and really very thoughtfully developed with all of the partners in the coalition, in the LA Apollo Alliance. And they were successful in winning political support and in passing an ordinance and in getting funding, and this is some millions of dollars, and ultimately getting a director for that program right out of the labor movement, out of SEIU 721, who became a director of that program, housed in the mayor's office. And to arrange for the money that was saved by the green retrofitting to be put back into the program. So it was very smart planning, but probably to me the most significant thing was the alliance that they built with labor, environment, and the community. And again, even though in terms of the environment it didn't do a tremendous amount, it did create some jobs, it did improve, buildings, and it's still going on, and there's still possibilities for it. But the relationships that were developed between these different groups is very, very important, because that lays the basis for more work together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our natural allies, labor and the environment. I'm not quite sure how natural we are, okay? We might be natural allies, natural and contradictory allies. Not all of the interests, as you've already heard. We've been soft-pedaling some of this stuff, but as you've already heard, jobs is what labor is mostly concerned about. And it's not a self-serving thing particularly. It's a survival thing. Workers need jobs. You've heard reference to this. I'm going to just refer to it once more. This past week in the LA Times, Appalachian miners decry war on coal. Okay? Important article. And typical. You've heard reference to it all over the place. Workers need jobs, and they're always going to be concerned about jobs. And as we probably most of us really are beginning to understand, if we haven't already, capitalism is based on growth. Okay? And it's growth because capitalists have a requirement to make profit for their investors. That's what it's all about for capital. Okay? And jobs are generally associated with growth. I think the labor movement really associates jobs with growth. I'm not sure they have to do that, but that's what they do. And that's where one of our big challenges comes in. And I think, and this is, I use the term front-loaded, we need to front-load the labor movement with developing